In 1953, a woman walked into a Catholic school in Kansas City, told the nuns that a little boy's mother had just had a heart attack, and walked out with a 6-year-old who was dead before lunch. The ransom demand that followed was the largest in American history. The money that disappeared after the arrest has never been found. This is the Greenlease Kidnapping, and it starts with the most powerful family in the room. Robert Greenlease Sr. was someone the word successful couldn't quite contain. He arrived in Kansas City in the early years of the 20th century, secured a Cadillac dealership in 1908, right at the moment when owning a Cadillac meant that you had genuinely arrived somewhere worth arriving at, and kept expanding from there. By the 1950s, his Greenlease Motor Car Company stretched across Kansas City, Oklahoma City, and markets throughout the Great Plains. He lived in Mission Hills, Missouri, a neighborhood where the hedges were trimmed so precisely they looked slightly embarrassed for you if you showed up uninvited. At 65, he married Virginia Pollock, and they had a son named Bobby. Robert Greenlease Jr. was born February 3rd, 1947, and by every account, that little boy was the center of his father's world in the most complete way possible. In August of 1953, 1 month before everything fell apart, Robert Sr. had taken 6-year-old Bobby on a summer vacation to Europe. They'd just come home. Bobby was about to start his first year at the French Institute of Notre Dame de Sion, a Catholic school in Kansas City. Life for that family was in full bloom. Carl Austin Hall grew up in Pleasanton, Kansas, as the son of a prominent attorney, with every advantage that a boy in that era could reasonably expect. A family name that opened doors, a private education, advantages most people spend years trying to build from scratch. Hall looked at it all and decided that it should require less effort on his part. In 1931, when he was 11, his exasperated parents enrolled him at Kemper Military School in Boonville, Missouri, hoping that structure would do what they hadn't been able to do. One of his classmates there was Paul Robert Greenlease, the adopted son of Kansas City's most prominent automotive family. Hall didn't befriend Paul so much as study him. He developed a fixation on that name and on that family, rooted entirely in the feeling that their wealth was adjacent to something that he was owed. When Carl Hall's father died and left him the farm and a substantial inheritance, he burned through it on gambling and what people at the time politely called the high life. By the late 1940s, he was robbing cab drivers. His entire run of taxi robberies in 1951 netted him $33, which is genuinely one of the worst returns on criminal investment you're likely to encounter. For that, he received a 5-year sentence at Missouri State Penitentiary, served just over 2 years, and was paroled in April of 1953. He walked out of prison with exactly one plan. Bonnie Emily Brown was born in 1912 in Clearmont, Missouri, to a prosperous farming family. She married in 1932 to a man named Vernon Headley, who turned out to be an Oklahoma bank robber. Vernon was killed by law enforcement in 1935, leaving Bonnie widowed at 23 and pointed in a direction that she never quite corrected. By the early 1950s, she was in a bungalow on South 38th Street in St. Joseph, Missouri, hosting parties the neighbors still remembered, drinking heavily and using her home for prostitution to fund the whiskey. She had inherited some money from her father. Most of it was gone. Hall and Headley met at a bar in May of 1953, about 3 weeks after his release. Within 2 days, he had moved in. Together, they were working through approximately 1 bottle of whiskey per day. Hall understood almost immediately what Bonnie offered beyond company. She looked like a respectable, middle-aged woman, exactly the sort of person a school might wave through an entrance without asking a follow-up question. That was the architecture of his entire plan. Carl Hall spent the summer of 1953 studying the Greenlease family's routines and even visited the school to walk the grounds. He spent those months coaching Headley on what to say, how to carry herself, and what story would get a Catholic school to release a 6-year-old without hesitation. Hall had decided from the beginning that Bobby would not be coming home. He considered the child evidence and had no intention of leaving evidence behind. At 10:55 in the morning on September 28th, Bonnie Heady walked into Notre Dame de Sion, dressed conservatively, and told Sister Morand that Virginia Greenlease had suffered a sudden heart attack while shopping on the Country Club Plaza and had been rushed to St. Mary's Hospital. She presented herself as Bobby's aunt, sent to bring him to his mother's side. Sister Morand went to retrieve Bobby from his classroom. Bobby was 6 years old, did not know this woman, but an adult that he trusted had brought her to his door with an emergency, and children are wired to follow that signal. On the drive away, Hall and Heady chatted with him about his pets. They stopped and bought ice cream. They needed him calm and were willing to be kind for as long as that served them. After switching to Headley's 1951 Plymouth station wagon at a Cat's drugstore in Westport, they crossed the state line into Kansas and drove to a field near Lenexa. Carl Hall's first attempt to strangle Bobby failed because the rope he'd bought was too short to get adequate leverage. In the struggle, Bobby lost several front teeth. Hall then shot the 6-year-old in the back of the head with a snub-nosed .38 caliber revolver. Bobby Greenlease was dead less than an hour after leaving school. They drove back to St. Joseph, buried him in a shallow foot-deep grave in Heady's backyard, wrapped in plastic, covered with lime, and planted fresh flowers over the disturbed earth. That same evening, the first ransom note went in the mail. The ransom demand was $600,000 in $10 and $20 bills, the largest ever demanded in American history at that point. A follow-up letter included the Jerusalem medal Bobby had been wearing that morning as proof of life for a child who was already gone. The notes told Robert Sr. that Bobby was fine, just homesick, and would be home within 24 hours of payment. Robert Sr. agreed to every condition. Arthur Eisenhower, a vice president at Commerce Trust Company and the brother of President Dwight Eisenhower, spent hours with bank employees recording the serial number of every one of the 40,000 bills going into the duffel bag. That work became the only thread investigators had once the money started moving. Over the following week, the Greenlease family received 15 phone calls and more than half a dozen letters, each a fresh lie delivered to a father who believed that his son was still alive. On October 4th, the duffel bag was dropped near a bridge on Lee's Summit Road in eastern Jackson County. Hall confirmed the pickup by calling the Greenlease home at 1 in the morning, and then he and Heady drove nearly 400 miles to St. Louis. In St. Louis, Hall adopted the alias Steve Strand and started tipping bartenders with $100 bills. He hired a cab driver named John Oliver Hager as a personal driver, handed him $2,500 for company, and then told him openly that he was an ex-convict. Hager reported his well-funded passenger to his boss, who had connections inside the St. Louis Police Department. On October 6, police arrived at Hall's room in the Townhouse Hotel, claiming they were investigating a gun complaint. When they found the metal suitcases packed with cash, Hall reportedly looked at them and said, "The jig is up." Heady was arrested shortly after, still asleep at the Arsenal Street apartment. When the money was officially logged at the precinct, the total on record was $288,000. That left $312,000 unaccounted for. Hall maintained until his execution that the full $600,000 had been in those suitcases. A federal investigation found the officers had stopped somewhere between the arrest and the precinct rather than going directly in. Both were convicted of perjury and sentenced to prison. The money was never recovered. Between 1953 and 1956, only 115 of the missing bills were ever identified in circulation. Bobby's body was found beneath the flower trellis in Heady's backyard on October 7th. Hall and Heady both pleaded guilty. The jury deliberated 68 minutes and recommended death for both. On December 18, 1953, less than 3 months after the abduction, they were executed together in the gas chamber at Missouri State Penitentiary. Heady holds the distinction of being the only woman ever executed by the federal government via lethal gas. Witnesses reported that as the gas began to rise, she leaned toward Hall and whispered for him to be a man. He did not, according to her, appear to be managing that very well. Robert Greenlease Sr. died in 1966, haunted in his final years by the knowledge that his wealth had made his son a target. Virginia Greenlease lived well into the 21st century, largely a recluse, permanently marked by a Monday morning when a woman she'd never met walked into a school and took everything. For decades, parents in Kansas City and St. Louis used the names Carl and Bonnie the way other families used the boogeyman, because sometimes the stories that scare people the most are the ones nobody made up. Thanks for listening to 10 Minute Murder, bingeable true crime stories. I'm Joe, the host. Hello. Here's an email. Subject, hotel room mistake. Hi, Joe. I travel a lot for work, and I made the mistake of listening to your podcast alone in a hotel room in Amarillo right before bed. Then the ice machine in the hallway made some weird noise at 2 a.m., and suddenly I was convinced I was about to become the opening scene of a future episode. So thanks for that. Julie in Amarillo, Texas. Now, Julie, I know you're not trying to blame that on me. As an also skittish type person, you should know better. Strange place alone in the middle of the night. Put the podcast down, Julie. I've said it before, that's why I listen to stand-up comedy as I'm going to bed. Even in my own home, I listen to stand-up comedy to get all this stuff out of my brain, to try to purge it before I get some sleep. Multiple times in my life, I've heard a strange noise in the middle of the night, convinced that someone was breaking in or had already broken in, woke up, walked around the house with a shotgun in my underwear, only to find that it was the ice maker. So I get it, but also, we know better. Julie, thank you for the email. Hey, if you're new to listening to this podcast, this is like the handful of first times that you've listened to it and you have not yet subscribed, please do that right now. Subscribe to 10 Minute Murder right now. You can also go to 10minutemurder.com and find out how to contact me, the different places you can follow the show on social media, and read the blog if you want to. I do need to mention there is a brand new podcast that I do. It's out right now. It's called True Crime Blueprint. Similar to this one in that it's me telling the stories. It's all me, but it's much, much longer. There's no time constraint on True Crime Blueprint. So if you like this, but you wish there was more of it, well, I've got great news for you. True Crime Blueprint exists. So search for that and listen to it wherever you're listening to this podcast. And that's going to do it. That is your episode for today. Thank you again for listening to 10 Minute Murder. See you next time.